Show you how a sermon map comes together real time. We're going to map the first 10 minutes of Mark Dever's sermon from Hebrews 2, verses 9 to 18. Just as a review, the sermon map is broken down into three major categories. The orange is explanation, the green is illustration, and the blue is application. We don't map presentation at the same time. It's tough to do, so we just focus on explanation, illustration, application. Whenever a preacher does anything, we put a dot. And then we connect the dots to show the sermon flowing through time. There's timestamps at the top, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10-minute mark. We're going to do the first 10 minutes, so let's watch a sermon map as it comes together live from Mark Dever's sermon. Here we go.
It's always good for me to be able to get out of Washington more some days than others, and out of my normal routines, and I do hear the most interesting things. I remember being at a bookstore years ago in Tallahassee, Florida, and there was a woman talking to about 5 other people. You know how they have those kind of community book discussions in bookstores sometimes. And I remember I was standing in the next aisle, so I wasn't right there, but I listened and I heard her say, "Welcome. I am a counselor, an astrologist, and a Methodist minister."
So he started with a personal story of something he overheard at a bookstore. So on line 26, we put a dot next to personal story, which is an illustration. Let's see where he goes next.
I think that kind of choice in religion, the choice whereby we dictate our own terms, was largely unheard of in previous generations. But Danny, I'm sure you remember Robert Bella's book, Habits of the Heart, like 20 or 30 years ago now. He talked about Sheilaism based on this character that was a kind of an amalgamation of people he'd interviewed. He noticed how people just pick and choose things they want to believe from different religions these days. And he called that Sheilaism.
Okay, so he shared a cultural observation about what times used to be like. Then he quoted a book not from Rob Bell, that would be playing with fire, but from Robert Bella, who's an older author from the 80s. So he shared a personal story, cultural observation, and then a quote.
She was expecting what she was pleasing, and she determined that that was what she wanted and would just think was true. I think so many people approach religion that way these days. Versace, the clothes designer who was killed
another
some
quote
years ago now, said in the last interview he gave before he was killed, "I believe in God, but I'm not the kind of religious person who goes to church, who believes in the fairy tale of Jesus born in the stable with a donkey. No, I'm not stupid. I can't believe that God, with all the power that he has, had to have himself born in a stable. It wouldn't have been comfortable."
So that's a cool combination there. He opened with a personal story and then a cultural observation and then a quote from Robert Bella and then a quote from Versace. All right, let's see where he goes next.
Now, most of us in our own denials today wouldn't be so bold as Versace was, but I think we have to admit that when we come to what we expect of religion, we do have different expectations than what Christianity presents us with.
Now, how do we map that? He's talking to us about our expectations. So this would drop down to application, and it would be line 43, which would be our motives, our convictions. He's talking to us. He's saying we have to confront our own expectations where? In church. So he gives us a where about religion or church, which would be line 49. You see how he's varying expectation by talking about motives in a certain place. Religion, church.
Honestly, most of us enjoy, naturally, a religion that is clear and powerful, that is respected and influential. I think as Americans particularly, we like our religion practical.
Ooh, now he added a who. He's also adding a element of a who. So he's talking to us about our expectations, motives in church about religion. And then he also added Americans. So who is line 52? He's narrowing the audience. He's talking to us about our motives, about religion. He's talking to Americans. A who.
I mean, it should be a proven agent of stress reduction, or at least of values clarification. We like the visible, the inoffensive, the powerful, the celebrated. We like popes addressing joint sessions of Congress.
So now he's making a cultural observation of what Americans want or expect out of church. So that's line 29 again. So he's combining he wants us to confront something, to see something in our heart. And what he's doing is he's showing that there is a cultural emphasis here on religion that we might embrace. So he's combining application with illustration.
That is a religion we like. It is clear, above board, and publicly respected. Like maybe Versace, we are less comfortable with the invisible, the offensive, the apparently, obviously weak, and the despised. Now, if you know your own heart well enough to know that's true, then you're in a good position to go back with me 2,000 years to a time and place where angels represented popular religion.
So he hit our motives one more time, and then he's now getting up to background and context, which is line 12. He's going to the original audience, so we'll put a dot, and he's right at about the 3-minute mark. So here's 2 minutes, 3 minutes, we put a dot here. Let's see what he goes next.
But this new Christian gospel that had come along with a surprising appearance. And it was that surprise that caused Christians for centuries to write books specifically about that. Like Athanasius's On the Incarnation of the Word.
There's a
or
quote.
Anselm's Why God Became Man.
There's another quote. So he quotes church fathers in their writings. And so that would be line 27 again, a real quick quote or a stat. And so we'll put a dot here, because he did 2 quick quotes.
Well, friends, this morning we want to look at what the Bible says about that question. Why God became man. So if you would, take your Bibles. Let's go to the New Testament. Let's go to the general epistles. Let's go to Hebrews. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 2.
So he's going to read the Bible now,
We'll
which is line
concentrate on
5.
verses 10 to 18, but let me begin with verse 5 to give the context.
I just put a line while he
Hebrews chapter
reads.
2, beginning of verse 5. It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. But there is a place where someone has testified, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor and put everything under his feet. In putting everything under him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to him. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God, he might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. But the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers. In the presence of the congregation, I will sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here am I and the children God has given me. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death, he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it's not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason, he had to be made like his brothers in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people, because he himself suffered when he was tempted. He is able to help those who are being tempted.
Is that about the 6-minute mark?
So friends, the question the writer of the Hebrews anticipates and answers is this. If Jesus is so much more exalted than the angels, which is what he said in 1:1 to 2:5, that's been his argument so far with the people. If Jesus is so much more exalted than the angels, then why doesn't Jesus look more exalted?
So what he did there is he drew our attention to a key theme. And the key theme was this question that the author's been dealing with since chapter 1. So we put a dot here next to trace a theme or do a cross-reference. That's what he just did there.
He appeared lower than the angels. And that's what we want to try to answer in our time together this morning. Why did God appear in such an unlikely manner in Jesus? He says in verses 5 to 9 that it was foretold that it would be this way in the Psalms. From Psalm 8, he says it's clear that there would be one who would be made lower than the angels, but who would then also be crowned and have everything subjected to him. And he says that this has been fulfilled in Jesus. We do see Jesus made lower than the angels, but he says there in verse 9, we do not see everything subjected to him yet. But he says there at the beginning of verse 9, and notice that important adversative, duh. You know, some of you may have translations here, some of you may have your Greek New Testaments here, but that important adversative, duh. We do see Jesus now crowned. Verse 9.
So he's tracing this theme that he finds in the text, and the way that he's doing that is he's looking around at the different neighboring verses, but he also just made a quick word study there. He referenced the Greek, and he even mentioned, maybe you have your Greek translation here, he referenced a different translation. These are different things you can do to explain the text. Trace a theme, line 9. Word study, line 8. Refer different translations. That's line 7. He's weaving within this lane of explanation, and we're charting everything he does.
Crowned with glory and honor. So yes, he was crucified, but he has also been resurrected and ascended to heaven, and he's presented his sacrifice to his Father, and now he's at the right hand of the Father Almighty, and it is to him that the Father has promised to subject all things. So the first people that this letter was written to,
some background context,
Jesus, to be tempted to worship more obviously glorious creatures.
First audience.
The critics were right when they pointed to Jesus' state being lower than the angels. I mean, even to the point of death, which the writer talks about more in just a moment.
So he's starting to camp on who Christ is, some Christology here. And when he does that, we're going to mark that on line 15. So there's every major area of doctrine found on the map. And when somebody starts camping on an area like Christology, you're going to note that with a dot, and that shows the theological nuances and the emphasis of the sermon.
But that was only for a while. And they didn't remember that their own scriptures contained these pointers that one such person would be exalted above all. So Jesus is now crowned, and he will one day, apparently,
at the 8-minute mark,
beyond doubt, rule all.
The Messiah, Christology.
Again, the question, why did Jesus appear, or why rather did God appear in such a surprising manner as Jesus? Why would such surprising things happen that the one who would rule all would for a time appear less exalted than angels? For a time. Why is it fitting, as the author says here?
So angels have come up several times now, and so what we're going to do is we're going to put an angelology dot. That's a major area of doctrine. And you see how there's a convergence here of the theology of Christ, the Messiah, and the theology of how he compares to angels. And so those two areas are being converged here.
Appropriate, seemly. Why is it fitting for Jesus to be so abased? And I want to give 3 answers in turn that the writer here gives us to this question. I'll tell them to you right now.
So he's going to give structure here. So we're going to come up, and when somebody gives a main point, we put a dot on line 2, which is where the main points are found. So we put a dot as he gives his main points here, and then we circle the dot to show that it is a main point, not a subpoint. And then we connect the dots. So far, we can see, leading up to his first point, everything that he's done to illustrate and explain the text. Let's hear his points.
You can write them down if you're taking notes. It's fitting for Jesus to become like us, number 1, if we are to be his family. Number 2, if we are to be like him. And number 3, if he is to make atonement for our sins. First, it's fitting for Jesus to become like us if we're to be his family. You see that really throughout this passage. It was hinted at in the verses the writer cited in Psalm 8. But Jesus' humiliation is examined and explained more fully here in the rest of chapter 2, where we find that Jesus' incarnation was part of his identification with his people, leading to his people's incorporation into his family. So incarnation, identification, incorporation.
So what happened there is he referred to the theme again. He's tracing the same theme of why Jesus had to become like us. And so that's line 9. And then he's camping on Christology again. But now he is combining it with ecclesiology, God's people. And I would include when there's a mention of Israel or God's people in the Old Testament there. That's line 20, just to consolidate it. So now you see an interplay between Christology and God's people, which is ecclesiology, and he's bringing those together.
The writer here refers to these people by many names. We see there in verse 10 the reference to God's many sons brought to glory. Verse 10, in bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. So one purpose of this God is pointed out there in that first phrase in verse 10. God desired to bring many sons to glory.
All right, so we're at the 10-minute mark. We just wanted to map the first 10 minutes of Dever's sermon. What can we see in his map? Well, he started with a personal story. Then he shared a cultural observation of what things used to be like. 2 quotes, one from Versace. Then he dropped down and started talking to us about our motives, about religion and faith, and Americans in particular. Then he came back up, made another cultural observation of what we expect, jumped up, shared a little background on the text, came back down, quoted 2 church fathers. Then he read the text. You see how everything shows up on the map. And then he traced the theme, did a little word study, referred to different translations, background context. Theologically, he's camped on Christology and also tied it into angels and the people of God, and he's given us one main point. So this is how everything is mapped real time. And I hope you can see the movement within the lanes and between the lanes. And I hope that this prompts you to want to learn more about sermon mapping. Now that you've seen a live one done, head to sermonmapping.com. You can learn how to read sermon maps and map them yourself.